There are men whose names become mythology before they even leave the room. Men whose silhouette alone, the jaw, the squint, the slow, deliberate walk, can fill a theater with a kind of reverence that borders on religion. And then there is the question that nobody dares to ask out loud. What does that man carry when the cameras stop rolling? What lives underneath the legend? What do the people closest to him try to keep the world from ever seeing? Because here's what almost nobody knows about one of the most famous faces in the history of American cinema. Behind the iron stoicism, behind the Oscar speeches and the box office records and the decades of quiet dignity, there was a wound that never fully closed. There was a silence kept so deliberately for so long by so many people who loved him that it almost rewrote the entire story of who this man actually was. And at 95 years old, 95, the truth has begun to surface in ways that even those closest to him can no longer contain. What was the one moment that broke him in ways no screenplay ever could? What did his family shield from the public for decades? And why, after nearly a century of living, does the answer to those questions make his life story not smaller, but immeasurably larger? Stay with this. Because nothing about the story you think you know is as simple as it seemed. He was born in the last month of May, 1930, in San Francisco, California, at a time when America itself was barely holding together. The Great Depression had arrived like a long, slow avalanche, and it had not yet finished moving. Clint Eastwood Sr. worked whatever jobs he could find, dragging the family from city to city, Sacramento, Redding, Piedmont, in search of work that kept disappearing just as they found it. For young Clint, this became the first curriculum of his life. Not reading or arithmetic, though those came in time, but rootlessness. The specific feeling of being a stranger in every room, of learning quickly which parts of yourself to show and which to keep pressed down somewhere nobody could reach. He was a big boy, unusually tall for his age, which meant he stood out in every new school before he even opened his mouth. Standing out without choosing to is a particular kind of childhood torture, and Clint learned early how to neutralize it. You become quiet. You become still. You let other people fill the space with their noise and their assumptions, and you watch. He became an observer long before he became a performer, and that habit, that watchful, measuring stillness, would define everything that came after. The family eventually settled in Oakland, and it was there in the humid afternoons of the East Bay that young Clint first found music. Jazz specifically, the kind that lived in smoky rooms and spilled out onto the sidewalk at night. He taught himself piano by ear, sitting at the instrument with the patience of someone twice his age, pressing keys until something like melody emerged. Music was the one place where the quietness of him became an asset rather than an obstacle. You could feel what he was reaching for even when he said nothing. That quality, that emotional legibility beneath an impassive surface would follow him all the way to Hollywood. But first, there was the Army. He was drafted in 1951 and sent to Fort Ord in Monterey, California, which sits on a peninsula of such breathtaking coastal beauty that it almost seems cruel to associate it with military service. The Pacific stretches out from those cliffs like a promise of something vast and unknowable, gray-green and cold, even in August, the kind of horizon that makes a young man feel simultaneously very small and strangely hopeful that IT was at Fort or that the defining wound arrived. The year was 1951. He was 21 years old, and he was aboard a Navy Douglas AD Skyrider, a prop-driven torpedo bomber, flying from Seattle down toward Mather Field in Sacramento. The flight was supposed to be routine. Routine is always the word they use when describing the moments just before everything changes. The plane ran into serious trouble. The fog was thick off the Northern California coast, visibility near zero, and the aircraft developed mechanical problems that left the pilot with very few options and almost no time to exercise them. The plane went down into the ocean near Point Reyes. Clint Eastwood survived by swimming. He was not a man easily given to panic. Even at 21, and the cold water of the Pacific at night is not a place that offers you the luxury of panic anyway. You swim or you don't. You find the shore or you don't. He found the shore. He dragged himself onto the rocks at Point Reyes, cold beyond shivering, in the dark, alive. And then he did something that perhaps only those who have been on the sharp edge of their own mortality can fully understand. He went quiet about it. Not the way people go quiet because they're processing trauma, though surely there was that. He went quiet the way a man goes quiet when something has rearranged the furniture of his inner world permanently. And he's not yet ready. Maybe will never be entirely ready to let anyone else see the new arrangement. That ocean, that dark water, that solitary swim to a rocky shore with nothing but the certainty that you would die if you stopped moving. It became the hidden architecture of everything he ever built after that. Every character who stood alone against impossible odds. Every stoic who said less than he felt. Every quiet man in every film who seemed to carry something ancient in his eyes that the screenplay never quite explained. It was there, the Pacific at night, and a 21-year-old who made it back and never fully talked about what it cost. For several years after the crash and after his discharge, the trajectory of his life was genuinely unclear. This is the part of the story that the mythology tends to skip. The years when the legend was just a very tall young man with no particular plan, working odd jobs, scraping rent in Los Angeles, knocking on doors that didn't open. He dug swimming pools. He worked as a gas station attendant. He auditioned for things and heard no from people who would spend the rest of their careers regretting it. The rejection in those years was not occasional. It was relentless. It was the specific texture of Hollywood rejection, which is not a single door slamming, but a series of doors being politely, cheerfully never fully opened. Casting agents who smiled and said they'd be in touch. Producers who said he had something but couldn't quite place what it was and wasn't that curious. A contract with Universal Pictures that got him bit parts and acting lessons, but very little sense of a genuine future. When Universal finally let him go, the reason given was almost comically discouraging. They thought his Adam's apple was too prominent, his teeth too chipped, and that he talked too slowly. He was 26 years old, recently married to Maggie Johnson, living in a small apartment in Los Angeles, and the town that was supposed to want him had effectively told him they didn't. Here is what he did not do. He did not spiral. He did not rage. He did not become the kind of person who turns bitterness into a personality. He did what he'd learned on the rocks at Point Reyes. He kept moving. He kept working. He kept showing up to auditions, to acting classes, to the unglamorous business of refusing to quit at something that seemed to be refusing him right back. And then, in a way that felt almost too ordinary to be fate, there was a television show. Rawhide premiered on January 9th, 1959, on CBS. It was a Western, which was not unusual. Television in the late 1950s was so saturated with Westerns that the genre had practically become its own broadcast network. What was unusual was the show's young ramrod, Rowdy Yates, played by a 28-year-old with a jaw like carved granite and eyes that seemed to be looking at something just past the horizon that nobody else could see. He played Rowdy for 8 seasons and 217 episodes. 8 years of early mornings, long days on location, the grinding physical work of a weekly television production, and all of it was actually a masterclass disguised as a job that he was learning. Every scene, every episode, every director who passed through the production carrying some specific piece of knowledge about light or composition or the relationship between silence and meaning on camera. He absorbed all of it. He was not a passive student. He was the kind of student who watches the teacher the way a hawk watches a field, still on the surface, missing absolutely nothing underneath. That'd be why the early 1960s, Rawhide had made him a recognizable face, if not yet a star. And then an Italian director named Sergio Leone sent him a telegram. The offer was for a low-budget Italian Western filming in Spain. The money was modest. The script, when it arrived, was clearly a reworking of a Japanese samurai film. The character had no name. He was simply the man with no name, though Leone called him Manco, and the film would eventually be known as A Fistful of Dollars. Eastwood's American representation thought it was a bad idea. Several people in his orbit suggested he decline, that he went anyway. He wore a poncho and carried a cigarillo and shot the film in the scorching heat of the Almeria Desert in southern Spain. And when it was released in Europe, it was like a detonation. Audiences had not seen a Western like this, stripped of sentimentality, moral ambiguity worn openly, violence that did not apologize for itself, and at the center of it all a man of almost supernatural economy of expression. The less he said, the more the audience leaned in. The more still he was, the more the screen seemed to move around him. He had found the exact frequency of himself, and it turned out to be the frequency of something universal that a fistful of dollars was followed by for a few dollars more, and then by the good, the bad, and the ugly, which became one of the highest-grossing films in the history of Italian cinema, and announced its leading man to the entire world as something genuinely new in the grammar of screen heroism. He came back to America not as the young man Universal had let go for having a prominent Adams apple. He came back as Clint Eastwood. The glory years that followed were extraordinary in their scope and their variety. Dirty Harry in 1971, Every Which Way But Loose, Escape from Alcatraz. The films were sometimes profound and sometimes pure entertainment, and occasionally both at once. And he made them at a rate that suggested a man trying to outrun something, or perhaps simply a man who understood that the ocean at night doesn't wait for you to feel ready. You swim, you work, you make the thing while you can still make it. But success at that scale carries its own particular gravitational field, and it bends everything that comes near it. His marriage to Maggie Johnson ended in 1984 after more than 25 years. The dissolution was painful and public in the way that only celebrity divorces can be, dissected in the press, reduced to narrative, stripped of the specific private anguish that only the two people inside a long marriage can fully know. The years of absences while he filmed, the complicated architecture of fidelity, the children, Kyle and Allison, who had to navigate the wreckage of two good people who had simply, over time, become incompatible. And there were other relationships, other children from other connections, 8 children in total from 6 different women, a fact that the press handled with varying degrees of sensitivity and that his family handled with the kind of protective silence that had become, over generations, something of an Eastwood family tradition. He was not a man who made excuses for himself, but he was also not a man who invited the public into his private reckoning. He held that in the way he held the ocean at Point Reyes, something known and acknowledged and carried, but carried quietly. The scandal that genuinely reframed the public understanding of him came not from his personal life, but from a podium in Tampa, Florida, in August of 2012. He was 82 years old. He had agreed to speak at the Republican National Convention in support of Mitt Romney's presidential campaign, and what followed was one of the most extraordinary and bewildering moments in the history of American political television. He addressed an empty chair. He improvised a 12-minute conversation with the absent Barack Obama, arguing with the imaginary president, asking the imaginary president to watch his language, telling the imaginary president that when someone doesn't do the job, they need to go. The internet responded with the velocity that the internet reserves for genuinely strange events. Within hours, the empty chair had its own Twitter account. Within days, the word Eastwooding was circulating as a verb. The reviews were savage from commentators on the left and uncomfortable from people on the right who had hoped for something more conventional. For several days, the conversation around Clint Eastwood was not about his body of work or his legacy or his artistry. It was about an empty chair and whether or not the most iconic figure in American cinema had finally, publicly, lost the thread. He had not lost the thread. He had done something deliberately strange and gotten exactly the reaction he perhaps expected from a culture that preferred its legends to behave themselves. But the incident did something real. It reminded the world that this man was not a museum piece, not a carefully managed brand. He was a live human being with opinions and impulses and an inclination toward provocation that he had simply been sophisticated enough to channel into cinema for most of his adult life. What came after was the reinvention. And it was not the careful, managed comeback of someone trying to rehabilitate an image. It was the work of a man who had always known exactly what he was doing and simply continued doing it. American Sniper in 2014. A film about Navy SEAL Chris Kyle that became the highest-grossing war film in American history and reignited every conversation about patriotism and moral complexity and the cost of service. He made it at 83 years old. The film earned 6 Academy Award nominations, including Best Picture. His direction was described by critics as lean, controlled, emotionally devastating. He shot it in 40 days. Sully in 2016. The story of Chesley Sullenberger's miraculous landing on the Hudson River. Richard Jewell in 2019. Cry Macho in 2021, in which he played a broken former rodeo star at 91 years old and rode a horse with the unhurried confidence of a man with nothing to prove, but he has said, in interviews conducted after his 90th birthday, that his secret is simple. He does not spend time on negative thoughts. He wakes up, he goes to work, he finds a thing in front of him that requires his attention, and he gives it his full attention. It sounds almost too plain to be wisdom, but it is wisdom. It is the wisdom of the man who survived the Pacific at night and decided, somewhere in the cold and the dark, that the only direction worth swimming was forward. The family he has built, complicated, sprawling, imperfect, deeply human, has circled around him in these later years with something that looks, from the outside, like protective love. His children have spoken carefully in interviews, walking the narrow line between honesty and loyalty. There are things they do not say. There are silences that speak. The heartbreaking truth that was kept from the world for so long is not a single dramatic secret. It is the accumulation of all the private costs of a public life, the absences that couldn't be undone, the relationships that broke under the weight of who he was, the children who grew up with a father whose face belonged to everyone and whose time belonged to the work. And underneath all of it, never spoken of in any interview, never written about in any profile, the night in 1951 when 21-year-old dragged himself onto the rocks at Point Reyes and chose, without drama, without witnesses, to keep going. He said that he does not believe in regret. And perhaps he doesn't, not in the way that paralyzes. But there is something in the films he has made in the last 2 decades, something about fathers and sons, about the cost of silence, about men who discovered too late what they should have said, that suggests regret is not entirely absent. It is present in the work the way the ocean is present in a man who survived it. Not always visible, never entirely gone. His faith is not something he wears visibly. He is not a man of churches or declarations. But there is something in his worldview, something in the discipline, the gratitude for each morning, the refusal to waste any of what remains, that carries the unmistakable quality of a man who has made peace with something larger than himself. He talks about nature. He talks about work as prayer. He has sat at piano keys for 95 years and found something there that neither fame nor failure nor the Pacific Ocean ever entirely took away. And now I want to speak to you directly, because this story is not only about one man's extraordinary life. It is about something that lives inside every person who has ever felt the cold water rising and wondered whether they had the strength to swim. You know what it feels like to be told no. Maybe not by a Hollywood studio. Maybe not in those exact words. But you know the experience of reaching for something and having the distance remain constant no matter how hard you reach. You know the specific loneliness of carrying something painful that you have decided, for reasons of your own, not to put down in public. You know what it costs. And you also know, perhaps only dimly but still truly, that the things you have survived have shaped you into exactly the specific person you currently are. Not in spite of the difficult parts. Because of them. What Clint Eastwood has been doing for 95 years is not simply making movies or winning awards or maintaining an image or protecting a legacy. He has been swimming. Every single day, from the moment he dragged himself onto those rocks at Point Reyes and decided to keep going, he has been swimming toward the work, toward the people he loves imperfectly but loves nonetheless, toward the next morning and the one after that and the one after that, with the specific and hard-won understanding that the morning is not a guarantee, but a gift, and the work is not a burden, but an answer to the gift that he still plays piano. Somewhere in his house in Carmel, California, a coastal town that sits just north of the Monterey Peninsula, just north of Fort Ord, just north of the ocean that nearly killed him when he was 21, he still sits at the keys and plays. Not for anyone, not for the cameras, for the same reason he always did, because the music was there, and because silence is not the same thing as emptiness, and because the things we return to when no one is watching are the only true account of who we actually are. So here is the question this story leaves you with. Not about Clint Eastwood, about you. What is the rocky shore you swam to that nobody knows about? What have you been carrying quietly that has, in ways you haven't fully reckoned with, made you exactly who you needed to become? And what would it mean not to announce it, not to make a film about it, but simply to keep going toward it the way a man in cold water keeps moving toward the sound of the shore? The piano is still there. The ocean is still there. The question is whether you are still swimming.